So I'm here with author Jim Ray Daniels. Thank you for sitting with me today on this interview. So let's see. You are a tenured Thomas Baker professor at Carnegie Mellon, prestigious university. You've published over 30 books. So I guess the first question is, did you ever stop counting
Stop counting books?
that you published? Did you lose count?
Well, I try not to be focused so much on the numbers, but they have accumulated over the years. It's hard to even define what's a book and what isn't in terms of like chapbooks, limited editions, books with poems and photography and things like that. But one of the things that I guess, really try to focus in on is to write a lot and to write regularly. It's my work, and I need to give it as much attention as I can. So I end up accumulating quite a bit of work over the years.
All right. Let's see. And what have you felt about in the wake of your success? What keeps you grounded?
Well, one of the things that keeps me grounded is that I continually have failure in terms of having my work rejected by journals and or getting reviews that maybe aren't so complimentary, and so it's. I'm always kind of challenging myself and pushing myself to. So I have my own high standards for my own work. So it's definitely a challenge just to keep moving forward and not. I try not to self-evaluate too much in terms of thinking, is this book better than this book, or is this poem better than this story? But I just try to keep moving forward and hope that the work is getting better.
All right. I like that approach. Let's see. I wanted to ask you about how you feel about the balance between education and experience. I like this one part of 8 Mile High about earth sciences. It's a science that for kids that aren't going to college. And knowing your background, growing up in a factory city, and now, like I said, teaching at university, going around giving talks, how do you reconcile those two?
Well, where I went to high school, the question when you graduated from high school was more, where are you going to work, Ford, GM, or Chrysler, than what college you're going to go to. So one of the big things at my high school was that we had an auto shop, and you could take classes in auto repair. And I think with the earth science thing, it was the idea that sometimes we get tracked into, not only in our educational system, but also in our social system, in our social class system, we get tracked into certain paths. So the title of my first book was Places Everyone. And that title poem is essentially about how people make assumptions about us that limit us in terms of what occupations we end up in and what kind of education we pursue and what being educated means in our culture.
Good. Okay. Let's see. I also wrote American Cheese. I'm sorry, you wrote American Cheese. But that one also has an interesting juxtaposition. It starts out with a department party, and you've got these cheeses that you can't even pronounce, and then you relate that back to the craft singles from your youth.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier that your upbringing has influenced a lot of your work, even today, years later. And so do you feel in any way as though you're obligated to give a voice to maybe this working class society?
Yeah, that's a good question. The poem American Cheese is about going to faculty parties in the university where there's a kind of more sophisticated milieu in terms of from what I come from a kind of six-pack and a bag of potato chips background, and suddenly you're having these fancy wines and cheeses that it was a little intimidating. And I guess, particularly when I first started teaching, it was a challenge for me. I didn't have a lot of confidence that I belonged there. I felt like I was an imposter and that someone would call me out and they'd send me on my way saying, you don't belong here. But the reality of that is more complicated, and I think I've certainly found a home in the academic world, even though I still have kind of a foot in the working class world. I still have a lot of family in the Detroit area. One of my brothers drives trucks for Chrysler, and so there's still that aspect of that background in my family and my friends back home. And I go back to Detroit frequently. So I feel kind of comfortable in various ways in both worlds, but I kind of see things a little differently than some of my colleagues in the academic world. And I don't feel an obligation to speak for anyone. I think sometimes that can sort of falsify things a little bit, because I remember early on where somebody was commented on my work and saying, well, you should be portraying these factory workers in a more kind of upstanding way. And I think one of the stereotypes on the one hand is the working class hero, sort of ennobles the working man, and on the other extreme is the kind of working class doofus that sometimes TV and film sort of exploit for humorous effect. And the reality is somewhere in between. And I think one of my goals was just to try to portray those lives in an accurate, complex way, as opposed to relying on any of the easy sort of stereotypes, because I think that does more justice to that life than anything else. It's just saying, hey, there's poetry in these lives too. It's complicated, just like everyone else, and just oversimplifying it or dismissing it is not fair or accurate. So I don't feel like I said, I don't feel like I'm speaking for them, but I'm certainly trying to bring their lives out in our literature and saying this is literature too.
Excellent. I wanted to ask how you felt about this. I read a review on one of your collections that described your work as bleak. And I think they're using a negative way, but in the luncheon we just had, you described your own work as bleak. And so, yeah. We were talking about love poems and certain voices that we expect to hear in poetry. So what is your response to this, austerity that you portray?
Yeah. Okay. So my wife's father is an immigrant from Croatia, which it was Yugoslavia then. He came over to the States when he was about 25 years old, so he's a grown man. And he still has a lot of family back in Croatia. And I've been back, I think, three times to visit his family. And particularly, twice it was communist Yugoslavia when we went back to visit. And there was kind of this dark, cynical humor there under communism that I kind of related to because it reminded me of the sort of dark, bleak sense of humor people would have in Detroit. And my theory is that it connects to the sense of anonymity and powerlessness that the individual feels. Like if you're working in a car factory, and you're, particularly back in the day when I was working there, if you were doing your job well, you were basically functioning as a machine. And so there was a sense of anonymity that anyone could just come in and do your job. So that it was the the notion of trying to assert your individuality in the face of a kind of these larger forces that were reducing you to a number or something like that. So I'm not sure if this completely plays itself out, but I kind of, like I said, I related to the sense of humor in under communist Yugoslavia because those people were also feeling sort of helpless in terms of asserting their own individual identity in a way that I felt like a lot of the auto workers in Detroit may have felt the same helplessness. So you resort to this sort of dark, fatalistic humor as a way of coping with that. So I think I've kind of absorbed that sense of humor in my own attitudes.
Lovely. I like it. Going back to this sense of identity and voice, you mentioned earlier that at these department functions that at first, or perhaps you still do, feel out of place in regards to your upbringing. So how do you feel that affected you positively?
Well,
Or I'm sorry, if I can add to the end of that.
sure.
Makes you different, but at the same time, how does it separate you from writers with more traditional backgrounds that you've met?
Well, I can tell you one thing, and that's I felt like I had to be careful not to get trapped into this sort of working class persona in a way that would keep me from writing about other things, because I have been teaching for a long time now, and that's a big part of my life. So I created this character called the Tenured Guy, and I wrote a series of poems about him because I've always been interested in writing about work. So I wrote a lot about factory work. Wrote a lot about some of the other jobs I've had. But it took me a while to start writing teaching poems. But in the last 2 or 3 books, I've had at least a couple poems about teaching in each book, plus this whole long series of poems about the tenured guy. So I've been trying to sort of examine. It seems like no matter what we do for a living in our lives, it affects every other aspect of our life. And that's something that's really intrigued me. Whether you're a college professor or a truck driver or working on an assembly line, you take those jobs home with you, and they affect, where you live, what kind of car you drive, how much money you have for leisure time activities, how much energy you have for leisure time activities, or whether you even have a job at all and you're on unemployment or looking for work. And so one of the things I've consistently been interested in as a writer is dealing with how work affects our lives away from work. My first real poem that I wrote, published in my high school literary magazine, was called Growing Up in a Party Store. And in Detroit, we call liquor stores party stores. Basically, it's kind of a 7-Eleven with a liquor license, but they were like these mom and pop stores. And I worked in one all through high school. And so I published 2 poems in this high school literary magazine, Patchwork. One was what I thought a poem was supposed to sound like. It was like this melodramatic, angsty teenage thing. I who am about to die, I who live but cannot cry. I am losing my mind, you say. Perhaps I think it went astray. Just this horrible. Those are just the first 4 lines. But the other poem was the first real poem I wrote because I was working in the store, and I was writing about something I knew about, which is we had a penny candy counter, when you could get candy for a penny, right next to the liquor counter. So you had little kids desperately wanting their candy, but the candy was behind the counter, and they had to tell me what they wanted. Right next to it, you had the hard liquor counter, and they had to tell me what they wanted, and I would pull it down from the shelves. So I juxtaposed the alcohol and the candy. So I was writing about specific things, and I was in a world that I was familiar with. And so I was writing a work poem. So for whatever reason, even my first job, I was writing poems about it in terms of just observing that work world and being, specific and concrete about it. So I guess that's a long answer to that question, but I've always been fascinated by work and how it connects to the rest of our lives, and how, sometimes I'll watch a movie or read a book, and I don't know what these people do, for a living, and I think it's probably gonna have more of an impact on everything else.
All right. Let's see. I want to ask you about, because in an academic setting, um, especially in the higher levels when we talk about masters or doctorates, poetry and fiction are often, marginalized, if you will. You have to pick one or the other.
Oh, right, right.
But you started as a poet, correct?
Yeah.
And then you moved into the realm of short story and screenplay.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to kind of get your notion of how it came to be that they're separated.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've been lucky to be at Carnegie Mellon, which quite honestly has been very supportive of all of my work. Uh, I've gotten faculty development grants for a couple of these movies that have enabled me to actually make them. And they weren't concerned that, I was firstly a poet or anything like that. So the university as a whole, particularly in recent years, has really fostered this sense of interdisciplinarity and blurring the boundaries between the genres and even the fields. I mentioned that I collaborate with a photographer in the design department there. So I've felt like I've been able to grow as a writer into different genres with the support. I do know of the university. I do know in some places where, if you're a poet, you're a poet, and if you publish some fiction, they don't count it. It's because I think our tendency as human beings sometimes is to try and put people into categories or boxes and have them stay there. It comes back to the idea of places, everyone. That our places are pre-described, and people don't want us hopping out of our boxes. So, no, that's your box. You got to stay there. And I think in academia and things sometimes are a little bit more territorial in terms of this is my area, and you write this, and I write this, and the tendency is to maybe separate them when we as writers have more things in common. And our program is structured, our undergraduate creative writing program is structured where students, have to write in more than one genre. They can't just do one thing, because when you're young, you don't know. I mean, I really didn't start writing fiction until I already had the teaching job at Carnegie Mellon. So it's hard to know how things are going to evolve as a writer. And you evolve within your genre, but you also evolve to cross over into other genres. And I don't think I have a novel in me. I like short stories, and that's, for me as a poet, that's probably long enough. But I feel like I would have the support to write a novel if I was ever crazy enough to try one.
Interesting, because I notice in a majority of your poems, there's this sort of narrative voice.
Right.
And so how do you see the relationship between poetry and short stories, short fiction in your eyes?
That's a good question, because narrative poetry has not always been, I guess, fashionable in poetry circles. And I remember I was writing these narrative poems, and people were saying, "Well, these aren't poems; these should be stories." But I kind of resisted that notion, because the first poems were narrative poems, and so there's been a long history of the narrative in poetry. So maybe it wasn't such a big jump for me from writing poetry to writing fiction, because a lot of my poems are narrative. But one of the things that I've liked about, in terms of choosing poetry for a lot of the narratives, has been the compression of language. It's like packing a snowball, I guess in Florida maybe you don't pack very many snowballs, but up north, you pack a snowball, and the harder you pack it, the more impact it has when you throw it and it hits something. I suppose that's kind of a violent comparison, but in a poem, you're just trying to pack it tighter and tighter. So you kind of strip a story down to its essence. And when it works, it seems to have a kind of greater cumulative emotional impact, perhaps. So I've been really interested in telling stories in stripped down fashion. and using line breaks, using rhythm. I mean, I don't write that many formal poems, but I certainly pay attention to sound, and I think I have been influenced quite a bit by, rock and roll music. I have a poem called Red Vinyl, which basically is about me starting to become a writer more through the influence of the music I listened to than the books I was reading. And so I like the music and rhythmic intensity that you can get in a poetry, in a poem that maybe is a little bit more difficult to achieve in prose.
All right. Interesting. I had one question that I wanted to field you on the notion of sacrifice and sort of choosing that box to continue your metaphor. What might you say to people that look up to you as a sort of like deity that just fell from heaven on a cloud with acceptance letters from the New Yorker and Paris Review? How can we kind of demystify that and really point out what it takes to follow this path, as it were?
Well, I don't think anyone looks up to me as someone who came down from on high. I feel like I'm still a scrapper, scrapping to get what I can in terms of publication and recognition and things like that. But my philosophy as a writer has always been, there might be more talented writers out there who are more skilled with using language, but my attitude has always been, no one's gonna outwork me. In other words, I'm going to work harder than everybody else on this, or at least as hard as I possibly can. And maybe that's why I tend to maybe have a lot of publications, because I'm kind of driven in that way. And so I think the brief answer to that is just that it does take a lot of hard work and self-discipline. That even with my students, they write this great thing, and I say, well, no one's going to come knocking on your door and saying, well, can I please publish this? You have to take it out of the drawer and send it out into the world and risk getting rejected. And certainly I continue to get rejected, and it doesn't really bother me too much in terms of, okay, I'm just going to send this work out to somewhere else and try and find a home for it. It's more of a challenge in terms of the book publication, because I think there's kind of more at stake there. It takes a while for publishers to get back to you, and even after they accept the book, sometimes it takes a year or two for it to come out. So because I write so much, I'm concerned about kind of getting behind in terms of the books stacking, unpublished books stacking up. I mean, I've been fortunate enough not to have that happen. And that's actually another reason why I switch genres, is because in poetry, because the audience is really pretty small for poetry. I mean, minuscule compared to some of the other fields. Though the readers of poetry are good people I want those people to be reading my work. And, I don't have any answers for, making the poetry world larger. But, there is a sense that I want my work to reach as many people as I can, and to, I got an email last month from someone who'd read one of my poems in a magazine, and it was a complete stranger. It was a poem about my son going away to college and how, up north we don't have, or at least in our house we don't have central air conditioning. They just have a window air conditioner in our bedroom for me and my wife. And my son was going away to college. We were in the middle of this heat wave. And when they were little kids, they used to come sleep on the floor in our room when it was really hot to get the air conditioning. So he was a 6'5" kid, my son. And suddenly his room's too hot and he wants to sleep on the floor in our room right before he goes away to college. And it was like, the sense of, well, yeah, it's the heat, but maybe also it's, he knows he's leaving home and he wants to have that kind of connection made. So this woman wrote me this note saying, a friend of hers, they were becoming empty nesters, and so she shared my poem with them, and it was very moving to them. And so one email like that, that can keep me high for a week. It's like, hey, I've connected with somebody on an emotional level, a complete stranger, and so that's it. So I don't need a lot of positive reinforcement. A note like that once a year, and I'm good.
All right. Let's see. We're running out of time here. I want to ask, what excites you about, I guess, the literary sphere in general now? I mean, you've been in the game, as they say, for quite a while, and now we're on the cusp of all these new things, different things changing. There's the dawn of ebooks, books being able to be spread to more people. There's Karen Russell, the youngest MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, from Florida.
Right.
A lot of things changing in terms of what people consider writing, like Towlin, if you're familiar.
Oh, yeah.
So what are you excited, or how do you feel about the direction of the literary world right now to come?
Well, I don't know, what's coming up next, but it's exciting just to see how rapidly things are changing, and and the interesting use of technology. For example, I'm doing this collaboration with this photographer, and the first two books we did together were in black and white photos, but she's been the latest project we're working on involves color photos. Now, color printing is much more expensive to reproduce, so we've been publishing a lot of our stuff in online journals, and where it can look really nice without the expense, and that's kind of an exciting thing in terms of just getting our work out there in a visual representation that would have been difficult and expensive to achieve before. I just did a project with a former student of mine who has a rock band called The Sexy Accident in Kansas City, Missouri. Check them out. Where I recorded in the sound studio in Pittsburgh a poem, and that they layered over the instrumental introduction to the song, and then they kind of put it together and mixed the sound out there, and you send these sound files back and forth. And then what he did is they published a hardcover book that had a card in it that had an access code where you can download the music. So it's like a CD without a CD, which was actually a book, where they had artwork and they had my poem in it and interviews with the band, but in a hardcover book. And it was just like, sometimes the technology allows you to do old things better. Like there's more interest in handmade books now, and letterpress. So the photographer I work with did what it's called an artist's book, where she made just like 5 copies of a book. Now you don't have to make a whole print run. Like before, print on demand has really changed publishing. So you need 10 copies of a book. Basically, a Xerox machine can make a pretty nice looking book now. And that's democratized publishing in an interesting kind of way, so that you can do it yourself, and more people are doing it yourself, and all the lines are blurring in terms of what's a book. And with the films, it's the same thing, where we can just put up a trailer on YouTube, and suddenly all these people are seeing my work in a different format. And so I think the technology has allowed us to get our work out there in new ways and try and reach a new audience. I mean, at my age, I'm trying to keep up with the things that are happening now. students of mine have been doing this wild stuff with kinetic type, type that sort of moves on the page. Where
Not familiar.
okay, I'll give you an example. So this kid did. He called it Elevator Sonnet, and then it was 14 lines, and there was an elevator on the screen, and then all these letters with arms and legs walked out and formed words for a line of the sonnet, and then they all walked back into the elevator, went down a floor, and they all came out and formed the next line, and then went back in. And so it was sort of messing with the idea of how we digest and incorporate text, because it was kind of controlling it in a different way, because the line would disappear once they went back in the elevator, so you didn't see all 14 lines at once. It was kind of one at a time. And so that kind of thing, again, would have been impossible, 10, 20 years ago. And so I think just being open to uses of technology that aren't dehumanizing, but are just, using words and images together in new ways. So it's kind of fun and exciting. And, I was talking about teaching, keeping me open to new things. And, I'm just trying to keep up with what's going on. And it impacts my work in various ways. I mean, I don't have the kind of skill set to do the kinds of things that some of my students are doing even, but I can certainly admire and appreciate what they're doing and just seeing how things are opening up. So it's kind of chaotic out there in terms of publishing and what's a publication and what's a book, but it's interesting. It's not boring, and I like that.
All right. I think we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much for answering all my questions.
Thanks.
It's been a great pleasure. Everyone that's going to be listening to this, is whether they're English major or not, are deeply invested in writing and reading. So any final words for our listeners?
Just thanks a lot. It was great talking to you.
All right. Thank you very much.
You bet.